It began in silence, the kind of silence that hides beneath the hum of the ocean, beneath the whispers of engines waiting to start. The year was 1943, and somewhere in the shadows of American intelligence, a quiet war was unfolding. A war not of bullets but of words, of lies carefully shaped to look like truth. They called it counterespionage. The Germans called it arrogance. History would call it irony. In the Pacific and across the skies of Europe, the Allies were building machines, fast, fierce, and brutally efficient. Among them was one aircraft, unassuming at first glance, that would soon redefine air superiority, the F6F Hellcat. But before it earned its name, before its roar was heard across the clouds, it was dismissed, underestimated, and even mocked by the very enemy it was designed to destroy. Because someone had told the Germans a story. And they believed it. The deception was elegant. A German spy, trained, embedded, loyal to the Reich, had infiltrated what he thought was the beating heart of American aviation research. He had come to uncover the secrets of the Hellcat, to steal the numbers, the performance charts, the blueprints of what he believed would be America's next great fighter. What he left with was exactly what American intelligence wanted him to find. A myth. He didn't know it then, but he was walking straight into one of the most successful disinformation campaigns of the Second World War. History often remembers the roar of engines, the dogfights, the medals pinned under the weight of smoke and glory. But this story begins far from the battlefield, inside quiet offices where minds sharper than bullets crafted illusions strong enough to shape the war itself. Somewhere in those rooms sat a man named William Donovan, head of the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. To the public he was a politician. To the Germans he was a ghost. And to his agents he was simply Wild Bill. He believed that wars could be won as much with deception as with firepower. And in 1943 he found his perfect weapon, misinformation. But before we dive into this labyrinth of lies, if you've ever found yourself fascinated by the untold sides of war, the hidden hands behind victory, the quiet stories buried beneath the noise, take a second to subscribe. Not for the sake of numbers, but because history deserves to be heard in full, unbroken, and unfiltered. Now, back to the war that wasn't fought with guns. The spy's name is lost to time, known only by his code name in declassified reports, Kriegvogel, War Bird. He arrived on American soil through the network of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service. He was smart, meticulous, and patient. 4 years he'd studied Allied production lines, intercepted communications, even bribed dockworkers and mechanics for scraps of information. But now his mission was precise: obtain every possible detail about the Grumman F6F Hellcat. At that time the Luftwaffe believed themselves untouchable. Their Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s had dominated the skies over Europe. They were lean, agile, engineered with a cold precision that mirrored the Reich itself. When word reached Berlin that the Americans were designing a new carrier-based fighter, interest sparked, but not fear. The Abwehr wanted confirmation that this Hellcat was little more than another clumsy attempt at naval aviation. The Americans were more than willing to help them believe it. What followed was a dance, a slow, intricate waltz between deception and desperation. OSS counterintelligence operatives fed Kriegvogel a carefully curated diet of falsehoods, exaggerated flaws, doctored flight data, and fake field reports describing the F6F as overweight, underpowered, sluggish in combat. It was theater, and every actor played their role to perfection. Somewhere in a dimly lit warehouse, engineers left accidentally discarded blueprints for him to find. Somewhere in an airfield bar, a pilot drunk on whiskey complained that the Hellcat could barely climb against a zero. And somewhere in Washington, a file marked confidential conveniently found its way into the wrong hands. Kriegvogel took the bait. He sent coded reports back to Berlin filled with the very poison the OSS had prepared for him. His words painted a picture of mediocrity. The Hellcat appears to be a desperate redesign of the Wildcat, heavier, slower, and ill-suited for high-altitude engagements. The Abwehr relayed the report to the Luftwaffe. The laughter that followed would echo through the corridors of arrogance. In war, intelligence is power. But belief is the weapon that turns power into illusion. When the first squadrons of Hellcats took flight, the Germans were unprepared. They underestimated not only the aircraft, but the industrial momentum behind it. The F6F was faster, tougher, and deadlier than anything they had imagined. Its 6.50 caliber guns could shred through steel and arrogance alike. By late 1944, the Hellcat had racked up more than 5,000 confirmed aerial victories. It was the quiet executioner of the Pacific, the machine that turned laughter into silence. And yet, few knew that its first victory had been won long before it ever left the ground. The illusion had done its work. Back in Berlin, reports of downed Luftwaffe aces began to trickle in. Pilots who once sneered at American design now faced death in burning cockpits. They called the Hellcat Die Fliegende Wand, the flying wall, because it seemed unstoppable, absorbing bullets and returning fire with devastating precision. Some wondered how they could have been so wrong. Others refused to believe it at all. The propaganda machine in Berlin continued to insist that the Hellcat was inferior, even as its wreckage filled the skies. That was the cost of arrogance. Disbelief in defeat until defeat became undeniable. But the story runs deeper than a single deception. It wasn't just one spy, one plane, or one lie. It was the embodiment of a philosophy, the American understanding that war was as much psychological as it was physical. If the Germans could be made to miscalculate, to delay innovation, to drown in their own overconfidence, the battle could be won before it began. And in that sense, the Hellcat wasn't just a fighter. It was bait. By the time Kriegvogel realized he had been deceived, it was too late. His network had been compromised, his identity exposed. The Abwehr ordered him to disappear. Some say he was executed in silence. Others believe he was abandoned, left to fade into the chaos of war. The OSS burned his file, leaving behind only fragments. But his legacy, the arrogance he carried home, remained woven into the downfall of the Luftwaffe itself. War, in its most brutal honesty, is not about who shoots first but who believes the right lie. And in 1943 the Germans believed the wrong one. Even now, decades later, the story of the Hellcat's deception remains one of the least known psychological victories of the Second World War. It was an operation where truth was weaponized and pride became the enemy. As the Hellcat soared through Pacific skies, shredding through zeros and myths alike, the men who designed it knew something their enemies never understood. The most dangerous weapon is not the one in the sky, it's the story they choose to believe about it. He first felt it in the silence between transmissions. The codes he sent, once answered within hours, began to return days later, colder, clipped, less trusting. Somewhere between the cipher and the static, Kriegvogel realized something had changed. In the early days his words had been prized. His handlers in Hamburg had called him our man in the West, the eye of the Reich in America's heart. But now his reports were met with quiet doubt. Reconfirm, they wrote. Verify with additional sources. He didn't know it then, but Berlin had started to sense what he could not yet admit, that perhaps the perfect spy had been played. In the small apartment he rented under a false name in Washington, Kriegvogel studied every newspaper, every public record he could find. The Hellcat's first test flights were making brief appearances in American papers, too brief, too restrained. It bothered him. He knew propaganda when he saw it. But this was something else. The Americans were hiding success behind silence. He pored over intercepted telegrams, snippets of dockyard manifests, aviation parts shipments. The puzzle did not fit the lie he'd been told. If the Hellcat was as flawed as his reports had claimed, why were Grumman's factories expanding? Why were squadrons forming so rapidly across the Pacific? He began to lose sleep. At night, as he stared at the ceiling, the echoes of his last transmission looped in his mind. The aircraft's climb rate is poor. Its turning radius inferior to the zero. Its pilots complain of sluggish control. Those words, once written with confidence, now felt like the noose tightening around his own throat. But pride is a stubborn thing. It feeds on fear until it becomes conviction. So he doubled down. He fabricated new observations to confirm his earlier lies. He bribed another mechanic, staged another photograph, intercepted another conversation, all to protect the illusion he himself had built. Because if he admitted the truth, he would be admitting something far more dangerous than a mistake. He would be confessing weakness. And weakness in the Reich was a death sentence. Back in Berlin, the Luftwaffe's intelligence division used his data to draft new tactical briefings. The Hellcat was dismissed as a lumbering carrier fighter, incapable of matching the agility of German designs. When the first aerial encounters were reported months later, command brushed them off as pilot exaggeration. Reality was cracking, but no one wanted to see it. The arrogance that had built an empire was now blinding it. In the skies over the Marianas and the Philippines, pilots began to whisper stories. They spoke of an American fighter that could dive faster, climb higher, and take hits that should have torn it apart. Some called it myth. Others called it hell. For Kriegvogel, the reports were daggers. Each one drove deeper into the facade he'd built. He tried to rationalize. Perhaps the reports were British propaganda or American morale fiction. He wrote frantic messages to his superiors, urging them not to believe the enemy's fabrications. His superiors agreed. They preferred the lie. It was cleaner that way. There is a peculiar comfort in arrogance. It shields the powerful from doubt, until doubt becomes unavoidable. The Luftwaffe command, drowning in denial, refused to re-evaluate their air strategy. They continued to produce fighters optimized for agility at the cost of armor, believing speed alone would preserve their dominance. But war had changed. By mid-1944, the Americans were not chasing the Germans, they were outbuilding them. The Hellcat, mass-produced and meticulously trained for carrier warfare, flooded the Pacific skies. In Europe, its technological cousins, P-47s, P-51s, turned the Luftwaffe's superiority into myth. The very belief that had once defined the Reich, that German engineering was unmatchable, became its undoing. And in that collapse, Kriegvogel saw himself reflected. He began to keep a secret journal, written in a mix of German and broken English, hidden behind the plaster wall of his rented room. In it, he confessed to no one in particular, "I was told I was serving the truth. But the truth has no master. It serves only those who dare to look at it." Each night his entries grew darker. He wrote about the faces of the men he'd deceived, the Americans he'd pretended to befriend, the pilots who laughed at the Hellcat's supposed failures. He began to imagine them dying in the skies, and felt the strange guilt of a man who had built the stage for his own enemy's triumph. He could not return to Germany. His cover was too deep, his conscience too heavy. In Washington he lived like a ghost, attending parties in smoke-filled rooms where officers and engineers traded gossip over bourbon. He smiled when they joked about "fooling Jerry." He even joined in. But each laugh felt like a confession whispered into a grave. And somewhere, in an OSS office not far away, men in tailored suits watched him from behind their teacups. They already knew who he was. The Americans had turned surveillance into art. Every letter he sent, every meeting he attended, was quietly recorded, analyzed, and logged. They didn't need to arrest him, not yet. A captured spy was valuable once. A useful spy was valuable forever. So they let him live. They let him write his reports, his warnings, his desperate reassurances to Berlin. Each coded message he sent only deepened the illusion, giving the OSS more insight into German thinking. He was a pawn who believed he was a king. That was the purest form of control, when the deceived becomes the instrument of deception. In August 1944, the tide of war shifted irreversibly. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, the so-called Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, became the defining moment of air supremacy. The Hellcats tore through Japanese forces with devastating efficiency. Nearly 400 enemy aircraft were destroyed in a single day. News of the massacre reached Europe within weeks. Allied propaganda celebrated it as proof of technological dominance. But in Berlin, disbelief lingered. Exaggerated, they said. Impossible. Kriegvogel read the reports in his apartment, trembling. Every instinct screamed that the numbers were real. And with each new confirmation, a truth he had long suppressed rose to the surface like a corpse breaking through ice. He had not only failed his country, he had helped shape its downfall. He tried to warn them one last time. His final transmission, decoded years later, read, "Reassess. Hellcat data may have been altered by American sources. Recommend verification by captured equipment." The message was received. It was never answered. By then, Berlin was burning. The OSS had moved on, its attention shifting to Europe's final convulsions. Kriegvogel's handlers vanished, his safe lines went silent. He became irrelevant, a man whose existence was proof of a game well played. But the ghosts of his choices followed him. In the post-war years, fragments of his journal were discovered in a Washington boarding house scheduled for demolition. The handwriting was frantic, uneven. The last line read, "To serve a lie is to die twice, once when the truth is born and again when it remembers your name." No one ever found his body. Perhaps he fled. Perhaps the OSS took him in, turning him into another whisper in the Cold War to come. Or perhaps, like so many men of his kind, he simply vanished into the quiet corners of history, forgotten, yet unforgettable. For the Americans, the deception had worked flawlessly. The Hellcat had not only dominated the skies but had done so under the cover of disbelief. Every German pilot who underestimated it had carried Kriegvogel's lie into battle, and most never returned. It was one of the few times in history when misinformation killed more efficiently than any weapon. And yet, in that victory lay a question that haunted even its architects. How much truth must a nation sacrifice to protect it? The OSS had won a shadow war, but at a price unseen. For every illusion they created, a piece of reality was lost. Truth, once twisted, never quite straightens again. When peace came, the same men who had mastered deceit in wartime found themselves unable to live without it. The methods of disinformation, refined in the fires of war, became the foundation of post-war intelligence. The lie had outlived the war. And somewhere, in a file marked declassified, 1956, a single note remains beside Kriegvogel's name, operative terminated by circumstance. Psychological value, exceptional. It's a quiet phrase. Clinical. Detached. Yet behind it lies an unspoken truth. The greatest power any nation can wield is not the weapon it builds, but the arrogance it allows its enemies to believe in. And for the Luftwaffe, for the Reich, for Kriegvogel himself, that arrogance became the sound of engines they never heard coming. The idea of deception as a weapon didn't come from madness. It came from math. Every lie that left the OSS had to serve a purpose, measurable and precise. For men like William Donovan, truth was no longer sacred. It was a variable to be adjusted, recalculated, optimized for victory. Inside a nondescript building in downtown Washington, behind locked doors and drawn blinds, the psychology of warfare was being rewritten. The men and women who worked there called it the Black Chamber, though officially it was the Office of Strategic Services Counterintelligence Branch. They studied not just what the enemy knew but what the enemy wanted to believe. That was the secret. The lie had to fit desire. If the Germans believed in their own superiority, then the lie would not oppose it. It would feed it. And so, in 1943, a handful of analysts, engineers, and storytellers built a fiction so convincing it could breathe. They created an entire dossier of false specifications for the F6F Hellcat, performance charts, wind tunnel data, pilot testimonials, all painting the aircraft as a lumbering disappointment. The details were exquisite. The handwriting on the mock documents matched the real engineers. The paper bore authentic serial numbers from Grumman's production office. Even the aging of the pages, creased edges, coffee stains, fingerprints, was deliberate. This was not improvisation. It was architecture. The mastermind behind this intricate illusion was not Donovan himself, but a quiet, bespectacled man named Charles Thornton. Before the war, he had been a fiction editor for the Saturday Evening Post. He understood narrative, rhythm, and above all, belief. When he joined the OSS, his skill was repurposed for something darker. He became a builder of lies so elegant they felt like memory. Thornton once told a colleague, "The best falsehood is the one that tells the enemy what he already whispers to himself." It was that whisper, the certainty of German superiority, that would doom them. In his office, Thornton drew parallels between fiction and espionage. A story, he said, needs a protagonist, a conflict, and a truth the audience cannot yet see. Intelligence, he argued, was no different. The protagonist was the spy. The conflict was the illusion. And the truth was whatever the enemy decided it was. He began crafting a psychological map of the German mind. He studied intercepted correspondence, propaganda speeches, even the rhythm of Nazi newsreels. The Germans, he concluded, worshipped precision. They believed engineering could substitute for imagination. That was their strength and their weakness. So he built them a lie that spoke their language: numbers. The fake reports detailed everything: the Hellcat's weight distribution, its engine performance curve, its supposed mechanical instability during high G turns. They included a fictional memo from a test pilot lamenting the aircraft's dog-like sluggishness. Another report described excessive drag at climb angles exceeding 18 degrees. Every flaw was an echo of German prejudice, that American machines were heavy, crude, and inferior in finesse. When the dossier was complete, the OSS didn't simply leak it. They performed it. Agents posing as careless officers lost the files near docks and airfields. Others whispered discontent in bars where they knew foreign ears would be listening. Rumors flowed like smoke, shapeless, invisible, yet everywhere. And slowly, inevitably, they reached the ears of Kriegvogel. The Americans knew he was real. They knew where he lived, how he thought, what he feared. They let him see what they wanted him to see because they understood that paranoia is predictable. Once a spy suspects he's being watched, he becomes his own jailer. The operation was codenamed Phantom Engine. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, it changed the way America would fight wars forever. Inside the OSS, some questioned the ethics of it. A few young officers argued that truth mattered, that they were corrupting the very values they claimed to defend. Donovan's answer was cold: you don't defeat evil by telling the truth. You defeat it by making it believe it's already won. That philosophy, cynical, brilliant, terrifying, became the blueprint for modern intelligence. The success of Phantom Engine had effects far beyond the Hellcat. It shaped Allied strategy in Europe, influencing misinformation campaigns like Operation Bodyguard and Fortitude, the elaborate deceptions leading up to D-Day. In each, the same logic applied: feed the enemy's arrogance until it becomes hunger, then let them choke on it. But behind the cleverness, there was a quiet unease. Some within the OSS began to realize that deception, once unleashed, could not be contained. They had seen it in their own eyes: the growing ease with which they lied, the thrill of manipulating an entire war from a desk. Thornton wrote in a confidential memo, "We are not merely deceiving the enemy anymore. We are teaching ourselves how." Still, the operation continued. In December 1943, a young Navy test pilot named Jack Caldwell became part of the ruse. He was instructed to stage a mechanical failure during a test flight and land publicly with visible damage to his Hellcat. Photographers captured the event. Articles were planted suggesting systemic design flaws. The images spread across intelligence networks faster than any coded message could. Thornton watched the photographs in silence. "They'll believe this," he murmured, "because they want to." And they did. By the time German analysts examined the reports, they saw confirmation of everything they already believed. The Americans, one Luftwaffe engineer wrote, build for mass, not mastery. That sentence would become a prophecy. Back in the Pacific, as real Hellcats began carving their legend into the clouds, the false image lingered. It delayed German innovation, influenced Japanese design assumptions, and bought the Allies precious time to perfect their aerial dominance. But inside OSS headquarters, Thornton began to unravel. The deception had worked too well. Every success in battle meant another life taken on the strength of his words. He started drinking heavily, haunted by the thought that truth itself had become collateral damage. One night he asked a fellow officer a question that no one wanted to answer. If a lie saves lives, does it stop being a lie? No one knew. The line between necessity and corruption had blurred, and no one could see where it began, or where it would end. After the war, the same question would haunt generations of intelligence officers. But in 1944, amid the smoke and triumph, no one had time for philosophy. The Hellcat was now a symbol, a machine born of steel but baptized in deception. Every victory it scored in the Pacific was, in some small way, a testament to the story Thornton had written. In another world, perhaps he would have been a novelist. Instead, he became the ghostwriter of history. As reports of German and Japanese losses poured in, the OSS celebrated in quiet satisfaction. The Germans never saw it coming, one analyst joked. They laughed themselves blind. Donovan smiled but said nothing. For him, the operation had always been more than a tactical trick. It was proof of concept. He saw the future in it. Wars fought with narratives, nations reshaped by perception. He wrote in his journal, "The age of bombs is passing. The age of belief has begun." Years later, as the Cold War unfolded, those words would echo through the corridors of the CIA, the agency born from the ashes of the OSS. Propaganda, misinformation, psychological operations, all traced their lineage to the same idea conceived in that small Washington office: the illusion of power, the cost of arrogance. By the time the Germans realized they had been deceived, the war was already lost, not on the battlefield but in the imagination. And that is where wars have lived ever since. By 1945, the sky itself had turned against Germany. Once, the Luftwaffe had been the pride of the Reich, A symbol of dominance, the sharp edge of Hitler's vision. Now it was a graveyard. Smoke and silence stretched across the airfields that had once echoed with the roar of Messerschmitts. The Hellcats, though built for the Pacific, had become legend even in Europe. Allied pilots whispered their name like a myth that crossed oceans. To the Germans it was more than a machine, it was humiliation made metal. Kriegvogel listened to the radio in his dark apartment, the curtains drawn, the whiskey stale. The American newscaster's voice was calm, almost tender as he recited casualty figures and victories. The war, he said, was entering its final phase. For Kriegvogel it was the final unraveling. Every report, every death, every shattered squadron was a reflection of the lie he had carried. He had wanted to serve the Reich with truth, instead he had served its arrogance. And now that arrogance was dying, not with defiance but with disbelief. He wrote in his journal one final entry: "It was not the bullet that killed us. It was the mirror we refused to look into." Across the Atlantic, Charles Thornton sat alone in his office at the OSS, staring at a typewriter he could no longer touch. The war was nearly over, but victory brought him no peace. His superiors praised him as a pioneer, the architect of one of the greatest counterintelligence successes of the age. But he no longer believed in success. Each victory report, each glowing headline about the Hellcats' unmatched kill ratio felt hollow. The weapon he had built was not made of metal but of faith, and faith, once twisted, never untwists. He began to have nightmares. In them, he stood in a vast hangar filled with hundreds of aircraft, each painted with words instead of numbers. Lies written in steel. He would walk among them, tracing his fingers along their wings, reading the names of the men who had died believing what he'd made them believe. When he awoke, the sound of typewriter keys haunted him, phantom letters hammering against his conscience. He tried to tell himself he had done what was necessary. That deception in war was mercy disguised as cruelty. But the thought rang false. Somewhere deep inside he began to suspect that lies, once spoken, never really end, they just change uniforms. When Germany fell and the Reich finally surrendered, the truth came crawling out from under the ruins. Interrogations, captured files, testimonies from surviving officers, all painted the same picture. A nation paralyzed by overconfidence, blinded by the very superiority it worshipped. In one report, an engineer admitted that when the first true specifications of the Hellcat reached them, they refused to believe it. It was not possible, he said. No machine that heavy could outturn us. No machine that crude could outclimb us. The Americans must be lying. They had not been lying then. But the damage had already been done by the earlier lies, the ones that fit too perfectly. Arrogance had completed the deception that espionage began. Thornton was called to testify before a closed committee to brief senior officials on the psychological lessons of Phantom Engine. The room was filled with military men, their medals gleaming, their expressions measured. They wanted numbers, charts, percentages, proof that deception could win wars more cheaply than bullets. He gave them everything they asked for. But as he spoke, his voice trembled slightly. "We did not defeat Germany," he said quietly. "We let them defeat themselves." A general smiled. "That's the beauty of it." Thornton didn't answer. He simply looked down at his hands, the same hands that had once held words like weapons, and wondered how many truths had died under his fingertips. Meanwhile, Kriegvogel's fate remained uncertain. Some said he was arrested by the Americans in the spring of 1945. Others claimed he vanished in the chaos of Berlin, his name swallowed by rubble and smoke. But a fragment of a letter, recovered years later, suggested a different ending. It was addressed to no one. The handwriting was shaking, the ink smudged. "To the one who made me believe, I forgive you. I only wish you had forgiven yourself." Historians would never confirm whether the letter reached its intended recipient. Some believed it was written by Kriegvogel to Thornton. Others thought it was never meant to be sent at all, just another confession to the void. But the two men were bound in a way neither of them ever understood. One created the illusion, the other carried it. Both were consumed by it. When the OSS dissolved in 1945, replaced by the newly formed CIA, Thornton refused an offer to join. He said he was tired of pretending. Instead, he retired to a small town in Maine, where he lived alone near the sea, writing short stories under a pseudonym. None of them were published in his lifetime. His neighbors said he was polite, quiet, and fond of long walks by the shore. They never knew he had once written the words that helped end a world war. In one of his unpublished manuscripts found after his death, he wrote, "The truth does not die in darkness. It waits. And when it returns, it asks for everything you took from it." That line would later be quoted by intelligence scholars as an early meditation on the ethics of deception. But Thornton never meant it for history. It was a message to himself, a man who had turned truth into a weapon and discovered that weapons never care who they kill. The same philosophy that won the war had already begun to shape the peace. Across the globe, new agencies, new governments, new doctrines rose from the ashes of victory. They studied the methods of phantom engine, perfecting them for the battles yet to come: Cold Wars, proxy wars, wars fought not for land but for minds. The illusion of power had become policy. By the 1950s, entire departments existed to manufacture belief. Propaganda became currency, perception became territory. And in this new world, Thornton's principles lived on, stripped of guilt, refined into strategy. He watched it all from afar, growing older, more withdrawn. Sometimes, in rare interviews, he would speak vaguely about the war, about deception, about how belief can move armies and destroy nations. But he never mentioned the Hellcat. He never spoke of Kriegvogel. He once told a local reporter, "The worst thing about lying to an enemy is realizing how easy it becomes to lie to yourself." When he died in 1961, his ashes were scattered into the Atlantic, the same ocean that had once carried his illusions eastward, to the man who had believed them. History, of course, remembered the machines. The F6F Hellcat remains one of the most successful naval fighters ever built. Its design, simple and brutal, reflected an industrial philosophy that favored endurance over elegance. But its legacy was not just measured in victories, it was written in perception. To the Germans it was a ghost, a myth they had dismissed until it was too late. To the Americans, it became a symbol of ingenuity, of a nation's ability to win with both muscle and mind. And to those who knew its true story, it was something else entirely. A mirror held up to the human condition. Proof that what we choose to believe can destroy us just as surely as any bomb. In the years that followed, the world entered a new kind of silence. Not the silence of peace but the silence of vigilance. The intelligence war continued, invisible and unending, built upon the same foundation laid in those small offices of the OSS. The men who followed never met Thornton or Kriegvogel, but they inherited their ghosts. Every analyst, every operative, every propagandist who crafted a narrative in the decades to come owed something to the operation that began with a single deception about a single airplane. And though the world moved on, the moral debt remained unpaid. Because in the end, the Hellcat had done more than defeat an enemy, it had proven that lies, once they taste victory, never stop flying. In the years that followed, silence settled over the story. It became one of those wartime operations no one spoke about in public. Too strange, too delicate, too revealing of how fragile truth could be when nations learned to bend it. The files were sealed, marked, classified indefinitely. Even within the corridors of the new CIA, few knew the full extent of what Phantom Engine had accomplished, or what it had cost. But history has a way of resurfacing like wreckage washed ashore decades later. In 1967, a young researcher named Ellen McCaffrey, working in the archives of the National Security Records Office, stumbled upon a fragment of an old OSS report. It contained 3 words: subject, Hellcat deception. She followed the trail through dusty boxes, faded memos, and yellowed photographs. Each piece hinted at a hidden chapter of the war, one that had never been written in textbooks. What she uncovered was not simply a military trick, but a philosophical experiment disguised as strategy. The war had been fought not only for land and power but for perception itself, the human instinct to believe what flatters the ego and dismiss what contradicts it. She wrote later, the Germans were not defeated by a plane. They were defeated by an idea, that their certainty was immune to error. Her paper, though never officially published, circulated quietly among intelligence scholars. It sparked debates, conferences, and moral reckonings. Could deception ever be ethical if it saved lives? Could lies, when told for victory, ever remain contained? The answer, like the war, refused to stay simple. Some argued that deception was inevitable, that every government, every army, every human mind lives by illusions of its own making. Others warned that once truth becomes a tool, it ceases to be truth at all. And somewhere between those arguments, the memory of 2 men, one who believed the lie and one who created it, hovered like smoke that refuses to clear. In the archives of the German Federal Intelligence Service, a single note remains in Kriegvogel's file: agent unaccounted for. Status: presumed terminated. Impact assessment: substantial. But to some historians that line reads less like an obituary and more like a confession. Because in every war of deception, no one really survives unchanged, not the deceived and not the deceiver. The illusion of power, once tasted, leaves a mark that no peace can wash away. By the late 20th century, the world had changed its weapons but not its methods. Television replaced telegrams, cameras replaced spies, and perception itself became the new battlefield. Nations learned to wage wars without armies, shaping public consciousness with the same precision once reserved for coded messages and forged blueprints. And yet, beneath all the progress, the same lesson from 1943 whispered through history: arrogance blinds faster than any enemy bullet. When the Cold War erupted, deception became policy. Propaganda, misinformation, psychological operations. All of it traced back to those early lessons learned in the dim offices of the OSS. Thornton's equations of belief and fear became the DNA of a new age. The names changed, operations, cover stories, fronts, but the mechanism was the same. Feed pride. Amplify confidence. Let the enemy's certainty rot from within. In that sense, every nation became both Thornton and Kriegvogel, the liar and the believer, locked in an endless mirror reflecting each other's illusions. For decades, the Hellcat's deception remained buried, overshadowed by grander tales of Normandy and Hiroshima. It was too quiet a story for textbooks, too uncomfortable for memorials. But among those who understood the anatomy of war, it became a legend, a cautionary tale about the day truth learned to wear camouflage. One retired intelligence officer once said in an interview, "The real victory wasn't that we fooled the Germans. It's that we learned how easy it is to fool ourselves." That sentence, stripped of politics, stands as the purest summary of the 20th century. Because the deeper truth of Phantom Engine was never about a spy or a plane. It was about human nature, our hunger to believe in our own superiority, and our blindness to the quiet hands that guide that belief. When Ellen McCaffrey visited the Smithsonian's Aviation Hall years later, she stood beneath the gleaming frame of an F6F Hellcat. Its blue-gray surface reflected the soft light of the exhibit, clean and silent, like a secret polished into beauty. Families passed by, children pointed, veterans stood in reverent silence. But she saw more than metal. She saw the story behind it, the invisible war fought in minds long before bullets flew. In the museum logbook, she signed her name and left a single line beneath it: "Belief is the engine that never stops running." The words could have belonged to Thornton. They could have belonged to Kriegvogel. Or they could have belonged to anyone who ever thought they understood power, until power reminded them it was only an illusion. Even now the echo remains. Every time a government spins a story, every time a nation shapes truth to comfort its people, the ghost of Phantom Engine flickers in the background. A reminder that the first casualty of war is not life, but honesty. And yet, despite it all, humanity endures. Perhaps that is our greatest paradox. We build lies to survive truth, then spend generations trying to find it again. The Hellcat's legacy is not its wingspan or its speed or its victories. It is the silence it left behind, the unspoken acknowledgement that even the mightiest fall not when they are defeated, but when they stop questioning what they believe. History moves on as it always does. The names fade, the files gather dust, the machines rust into monuments. But every time a new conflict begins, every time arrogance whispers, "We cannot be deceived," the story returns quietly like a warning carried by the wind. It tells us that power without humility is blindness, that pride without truth is surrender, and that the greatest weapon ever built was not the Hellcat, nor the bomb, nor the bullet, but the illusion of knowing what victory truly means. Somewhere, in another time, another war will test that lesson again. And perhaps, if we're listening, we'll hear the faint echo of those who came before. Two men on opposite sides of the same mirror, both chasing a truth that refused to belong to either. One built the lie. One believed it. And both discovered that in the end, the difference between them was only circumstance. When the camera of history pulls back, the world grows small again. Just clouds, smoke, and the endless hum of engines fading into the horizon. And in that fading hum lies the question that will outlive every empire, every deception, every illusion of power. When the truth finally comes home, will we still recognize it?